Welcome in, everyone. You're listening to Bull Central. We are in the midst of the All-Star break. Limited representation from the Bulls at All-Star Weekend, with just Modest Bucelis being a participant. But regardless, I've got a very special guest on today. You know her for all of her great work that she does covering this team, the Bulls, as well as the Chicago Sky for the Chicago Tribune. It's my pleasure to welcome back to the show Julia Poe of the Chicago Tribune. Julia, it's great to see you again, and appreciate you making the time.
Yeah, you too. Great to be on.
Now, if you're not already, be sure to give Julia a follow at by Julia Poe on Twitter. Check out all of her great work at the Chicago Tribune. I'll leave links to all of that in the description. Now, Julia, going into the break, the Bulls are riding a four-game losing streak. They've just looked very disjointed since after the trade deadline. Obviously, Zach LaVine ends up being the only player moved prior to the deadline. Which has frustrated a lot of fans, as there still seems to be a lack of clarity on the direction of this team. I feel like from a fan perspective, we're kind of at this place where we're just sort of waiting for the season to be over and seeing what the Bulls are going to do this offseason, especially, what they're going to do in terms of landing in the draft lottery. But I guess before we talk about the offseason, I wanted to ask, what was your take on the Bulls' approach to the trade deadline? Were you surprised at all at how things ended up going down?
I don't think I have the capacity to be surprised too much with inaction from this front office at this point. Like we go into it and you're looking just kind of at what they're working with, at their ability to get things over the line in the past, and being able to even execute the Levine trade was a huge success in some ways, even if it was fairly underwhelming. Being able to figure out where they wanted to go with Lonzo Ball was at least a small accomplishment. I think for me at this point, I am really struggling to get my head around this continued insistence that, oh, the next window there will be better offers available. And I think that at this point, when you talk about how many years we've been getting that same explanation from executives on the record, from folks, behind the scenes on background, that's pretty much the calling card of this team. But there's no real logic to it at this point. We just kind of keep getting the same story of, there will be a better Vucevic offer in the summer. There will be better Kobe White offers in the summer. There will be this, there will be that. And then you get to the next window and it's just being kicked down the road again and again. So I think that's kind of where I'm at with it. I don't fully understand it. And obviously we're not in these rooms, we're not hearing the offers that are being given, but you hit a point where it's just really hard to believe that the value is always like just around that next corner. It just kind of feels like this team is getting led on a fishing rod and never actually like getting anywhere with it.
Well, you talked about offers, and I was actually curious. I had Darnell Mayberry on last week, and we talked at length about the deadline. But one thing he did mention, quite frankly, I was shocked to hear. But he mentioned that John Hollinger reported that the Bulls had a first round pick on the table for Lonzo Ball. Now, not all first round picks are created equal, with protections often put in place on them. But, were you hearing similar offers for Lonzo Ball from your sources? And even just outside of Lonzo, we heard about Kobe White potentially being in discussions with the Orlando Magic, obviously Vucevic with the Warriors. And so you were talking about offers and then the value potentially being there later on down the line. In your view, based on what you were hearing, were the offers good enough that you think it made sense to actually make a move?
Yeah, so I'm going to separate these out into Lonzo and then
Okay.
everyone else. In the Lonzo department, I might be in the minority with this. I am okay with what they did at this deadline. I think that one of the main things that I think all of us were kind of hearing, not just from the Bulls, but from, kind of executives across the league, was this concept that a lot of teams just still would like to see Lonzo play more games to just feel that full faith in his knee working. Like he's still on
Sure.
a minutes restriction. He's still trying to do something that no one has ever done before. And I think every single time that he goes out there and plays a game, his value ticks up a little bit. And it just kind of
Sure.
is going to continue doing that. I do not mind at all, especially being around him, what he does for that locker room. He's so like he's relatively reserved, relatively quiet, but he lifts a standard. It kind of similarly to how Alex Caruso was able to lift standards in the locker room in a way that is incredibly beneficial for a young group to be around. So
Yeah.
I have no issue with them. That is the one area where I actually do believe the concept that if you give him this extension, you're going to get good value out of it and you get to next trade deadline. there's going to be better offers on the table for him because as long as that knee holds together, he's just going to continue kind of building on that value from game to game. So I would put that in one category. I think with everyone else, it's really difficult for me, especially we've seen how this team plays without Zach LaVine, and it's not going to get better. Like it's just not. Vooch is struggling. Kobe White is struggling. No one offensively on this team is equipped to step in and be Zach LaVine, which is totally fine. But they're not even able to kind of accommodate for him in the aggregate. I think they really underestimated how difficult it would be for Kobe White to all of a sudden be drawing all of those primary defenders and to
Right.
be that primary defensive assignment. And that's nothing against Kobe. I think that he is wonderful in the role that he has been asked to play before, where he's like that third guard on the team. But you ask him to
Sure.
be the primary guard, he's not going to look as good and he's not going to get as good of offers. Same thing with Vooch. Now that you don't have to worry about Zach at the 3 point arc, he's just getting absolutely hammered in terms of his efficiency out there.
Right.
So I put those in two different camps. I think if they could have moved on Kobe or Vooch this deadline, they should have. I think with Lonzo, you do wait and see, and just hope that his recovery kind of continues the way it has.
Yeah, I question on the Lonzo piece though, because I actually am
Yeah,
like you.
yeah,
And I got a lot of pushback from my viewers saying that if there is any player at the deadline that I wouldn't mind the Bulls keeping, it was Lonzo Ball. And it was for all
yeah.
the reasons that you described, as far as, his IQ, the leadership that he brings to the locker room, great mentor for the younger guys. And you can probably get him for pretty cheap, which the Bulls did. So when I saw the extension come through, I was all about it. I was like, this makes sense. Team option on the second year, right? So it's technically only a 1 year agreement if they really wanted it to be, and his value is going to be more the following season. I liked it until I heard Darnell Mayberry told me that there was a first round pick on the table. Um, and so to me, it was like, well, if they wait another year, they can probably get a first round pick for him. But if that was already on the table, why would they not jump on that? I guess I'm curious, were you hearing similar things? And then maybe, any shed light on as far as what type of first round pick was it? Because if it's one of those like Portland first round picks that's never going to convey and ends up being a second round pick, then yeah, I can see that. Or if they had to take on like a Bradley Beal as an example, then no, it's probably not worth it because that's a lot of money to bring onto your books for a player that's probably not going to be part of your long term plan.
Exactly. Yeah. So I will be honest, I don't have anything further than what John had reported out on it. But I do think that we just return back to kind of what you said, which is that not all picks are created equal. The
Sure.
position I don't like being in here is normally with the front office, I think you would say, well, you just have to trust that that pick was not good enough, that it did have some of those things. I don't know if we necessarily have, if this front office has earned that level of trust of being able to say, well, surely it was this, surely it was that, which is a frustrating spot to be in. And I think that is something where if we hear over the summer or even just like toward the end of this year that it was in fact a favorable first round pick, I do think that's where it gets a little head scratchy because like obviously we all want Lonzo to just sail into this new era of his career perfectly fine, but it's still questionable. We still don't know what's going to happen in terms of his availability. And I think that whenever you can get a favorable first round pick for him, you got to move on it immediately, both for the Bulls and for Lonzo getting into potentially a winning situation. If that runway for his career is shortened, he deserves to be on a winning team. The Bulls deserve to get something out of this like years long investment in his recovery. It's just kind of, they need to find that win-win deal as fast as possible.
I want to go back to Kobe White real quick as well, because I do have to ask, how real were some of the trade rumors on Kobe White? There were reports, like I mentioned before, they were engaged in talks with Orlando Magic. Um, how real were those conversations, and do you think that in the offseason that those conversations will be seriously revisited?
So the general sense around the trade deadline was that Kobe was definitely the lowest likelihood of kind of that trio of trade
Okay.
offers, Zach and Vooch and Kobe. And I think that's not surprising. I would be curious to know from other teams' perspectives how hard it felt like the Bulls were actually shopping Kobe. Because for all of the reasons I said before, I think that Kobe White has been put in Chicago in a lot of situations to fail in a lot of ways.
Sure.
He has
Sure.
never had a consistent role, which understandable. Some players are not of like the certain star power caliber where you can expect a consistent role. Sometimes you have to be adaptable. But even just this year of there being zero conversation with him from the front office before they brought in Giddy, like he was never talked to by anyone about the fact that he was not going to be starting point guard anymore. That was,
Right.
he's very open about that. He's talked to us about, there was no call, no conversation. He just came into training camp and had to look around and be like, okay, what are they asking me to do? And now that he is that primary scoring option, I do not think that that is going to pay off the way that maybe it would in some other situations. He's just going to get hammered defensively throughout the rest of this
Right.
season and potentially next. So I think that that should be a really big priority for this team to get Kobe, to get as much value out of a Kobe deal, both to be able to kind of take this next step forward and also to just be able to move off of that before his next contract comes up and his value comes up because he is an incredibly valuable player for this team still. And I don't think that maybe there was enough foresight in coming into this deadline of like, look, if we do move Zach, things are going to change for Kobe really rapidly again, and it's not necessarily going to do what we want to multiple trades down the line, if that makes sense. So that's kind of where I'm at with it. I just don't think this has always been the problem with this front office group is they're not looking three moves down the line. They're just so
Right.
fixated on one that they kind of get a little bit lost in terms of that longevity.
Bill Simmons said on his podcast recently, which was getting a lot of traction and debate on Twitter, when he said that, he wouldn't take the Bulls' current roster and their future over any other team in the Eastern Conference. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I also recognize that I'm a biased fan. For you, as an objective journalist, do you agree with that statement? And I guess sort of maybe two-part question. What would the Bulls need to do to really change that narrative?
Yeah, I think the
I think I
East
lost
is
you.
in a tough spot where hold on, did that freeze? Are you
There you
back?
go.
Sorry.
I'm
Okay.
there you go. There you go. Did
Okay.
you hear my question? No, the
Um,
question? I can repeat it
yes,
if you
yeah,
want.
yeah, I
Okay.
heard you. Yeah. So no, I think the Eastern Conference, I think you could say that about a lot of teams kind of on the back half of the Eastern Conference. I just
Mm,
think like I look at where Philly is at and I am like, I don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole in a lot of
right.
ways. They're just in a real tough way. So I don't necessarily disagree with that in that I think that there are about six project teams in the Eastern Conference, and I feel like all of them just feel very overwhelming in terms of coming from an executive standpoint of like, okay, where do we even start? How do we build out of this? Because they've allowed their rosters to get so lopsided and have lost track of picks along the ways. And that's just not a good position to be in. I think for the Bulls, when you look at first steps, I think the big thing is just figuring out the problem with the way that they have not prioritized draft capital is that you have to start deciding, you have to make that decision. And I swear I said this to you the last time I was on this podcast. You have to make a decision of which way you want to build a team.
Yeah.
And I think we heard Arturas kind of go a little bit off script with him trying to explain how you build a team by getting like eight great players. At the trade deadline, he had that quote where he talked about how you want to get eight good players rather than two or three great ones, and everyone was kind of like, "What the hell are you talking about?" But I think that if you're the Bulls front office, you have to decide: do we want to start becoming a team that trades for a couple of more developed guys and starts trying to build around players that are already in the league, or do we start really, really honing in on the draft? And you have to pick one or the other, and then you have to prioritize. And I think obviously the draft is the more popular way to go. I think people get very excited about the idea of bringing in a lot of talent through the draft. And the issue with the way that the Bulls have kind of operated is they've had a lot of good assets that they've just kind of let go. And so now
Yeah.
you don't have any of the capital to actually build with. But I think that that's step one. You have to, this team needs a star. And even just the reaction to Matas Buzelis, who is so exciting and also at this point is a deeply flawed 20-year-old player. Like he has so many things to build on. He will be the first to say that. But the reaction that people have had to just like a young, exciting prospect you need to keep building on that even as just a business product because they
Sure.
cannot keep just recycling the same level of like mediocrity through again and again. And I think that going young is a great way, even just to sell a product. People love someone young and new and fresh who's got a little buzz on them out of college.
Do you think other executives around, I'm kind of thinking about what you were saying about that press conference with AK. Do you think other executives around the league take the Bulls seriously? And I ask in the sense of, I think initially when, AK Mark Eversley came in and made some big moves in 2021, right? They traded for Vucevic. They brought in Lonzo, DeMar, Caruso in that summer, and people were like, okay, they mean business, right? And so, in
Yeah.
a way, it kind of lended some credibility. It took them seriously, even if people didn't necessarily agree with the moves. Like, is that really going to fit? It's like, okay, well, they're being aggressive. Now you're kind of seeing the opposite, right? And so it leads you to wonder, are executives when they have conversations with the Bulls kind of viewing in the sense like we can just take these guys to the cleaners because they don't really know what they're doing? Do you think that that perception exists around the league?
I think that that is definitely where this front office is trending towards. And I think the general sense that you get around the league, top to bottom, is confusion over just what's happening, what is the direction here.
Right.
I think there are situations where a fan base can maybe have huge questions, and then you go to the folks that are behind the scenes, executives, coaches, et cetera, and they feel a lot less like uncertain. I think there's a little bit more of a through line here in terms of like everyone's seeing the same thing. Everyone's seeing the same kind of roster moves and the same. I think the inaction over the last 3 years really confused people of like, okay,
Yeah.
what are you waiting for? What is the big fish that you're trying to get out of all of this? So yeah, I that is certainly where things are trending toward. And I think that, this is a great trade deadline for maybe not being at least at the forefront of people's minds in terms of executives that have people asking big questions about what they're doing, but it certainly is a general sense of this is an aimless team and an aimless franchise. And that, in some ways, is like the worst label that you can have because it makes it harder to even do business with a front office because if you can't tell what someone's objective is, it's really difficult to even figure out how to manipulate that objective to your own means and get something out of it. It's just kind of makes it really tricky for everyone involved.
Yeah, yeah, you're talking about that. I think Nico Harrison really saved AK, right? This trade deadline. Um, yeah, when I had Darnell on last week, he was talking about, there is, an element of grace that should be lended towards the front office, meaning giving them more time, not necessarily, absolving them from mistakes and things that have transpired in their limited time running the team. But I'm curious, do you think because we saw that vision initially, because we saw them assemble a team that actually was working, although who knows if it would have worked long term, but then Lonzo Ball obviously got injured and things kind of went haywire after that. Do you think, as fans, myself as fans, that we need to be a little more patient in the sense that, okay, this didn't work, they're trying to clean it up. It's not in the way that we would want, and they obviously have done it a little too late, but maybe giving another roster iteration before we start saying, all right, fire these guys, get them out of here. They clearly don't know what they're doing.
I think so. Yes, like I definitely agree with Darnell in terms of like this is hard and having to pivot off of a project, especially when injuries are involved, is really difficult.
Right.
I think I think it's really difficult to, like you said, to even know how good that group was. I think people forget so often that about half of the like great times that that team had together in 2021, 22 was during that period where half the league was out with COVID. Like they were
Sure.
beating G League
Bad team.
teams.
Right.
Yeah, really bad teams. Teams where guys hadn't even played together because you're just grabbing bodies to get in. But I do think yes, like this is more difficult than it looks, and pivoting off and knowing when to pivot off of that project is really difficult. I think for me, the thing that I really struggle with is seeing a team fail to recoup value as consistently as this one has.
Right.
that's where you start struggling with being like, you can not even know where you're going. You can have some bad like draft picks.
Sure.
I have probably the highest bar of grace with draft picks because I just think that especially now that we're trying to do picks that are 19 years old, it's really easy to miss on a 19-year-old. And
Sure.
I personally am not anyone who's going to be like, oh my God, how could you tell that this 19-year-old wasn't going to turn into, you know, XYZ player? But I think that we are in the last probably year of the grace period for myself personally. And I think there's a lot of ways to get out of it, but it does just require a certain level of consistent competence over the next year of, if you move Vooch, if you move Kobe, if you draft well, if it feels like, okay, we're starting to see a little bit of a new project come together next year, then absolutely, you've bought yourself a little bit more time. It just can't be this same thing of I don't I don't know. I'm hitting the end of my rope of being able to hear about November 2021. You know what I mean? Like we're getting kind of toward the end of being able to look back and be like, well, we put together these 3 great months. I
Right.
don't know. Do you want to put a banner up for that? I don't know if I don't know what you get out of that. You have to be able to at least consistently build projects to
Yeah.
keep earning that grace.
Yeah. And I think you kind of hit some on the head there. One thing that's frustrated with me about this front office, and it's changed a little bit more recently, but was a level of accountability, right? I mean, I think we know that they have a hard time admitting when they're wrong. They have a hard time accepting defeat. And so you get to a point where it's like, okay, well, clearly something's not working and you need to be held accountable. And so rarely have we seen instances of them saying, we were wrong or we failed, right? I mean, we're seeing that a little bit now because they kind of have to, but that's been something that's been really frustrating for me in watching this front office. Um, and talking about, you're talking about draft picks, right? Hitting on draft picks. Modest Buzelis, I want to talk about him real quick. So, obviously, fell to the Bulls at number 11 when I think a lot of people expected him to go a lot higher. Obviously, a player that's still very raw, has a lot of work to do in terms of improving his game, but there's a lot of potential there for Modest, right, to be that franchise
Yeah.
cornerstone. As the Bulls are going into the remainder of this season post All-Star break, how should they be utilizing Modest to get the most out of his development over these next couple months?
Yeah, so I think obviously Mata's his playing time has been a huge focal point for fans. I was even one of the reporters that was kind of beating the drum of him needing to play more at the start of the season. And I will admit my own kind of changing opinions on this. I think Billy Donovan is playing this incredibly well. And I think that the general sense that I have gotten out of talking to Modest a lot, talking to Billy about Modest a lot, is he is absolutely he's very smart. He is incredibly competitive. He doesn't shrink from moments. He was very overwhelmed by defensive assignments, by off-ball defense, by a lot of really basic things from the jump. He was coming from honestly a situation in the G League where I think he was probably prepared less in some ways than even collegiate coaching would have
Sure.
necessarily prepared him to kind of come into the league. And so I think that the taper that they did to get his minutes up to where they are right now is a good thing. And I'm not even against some of these games where you see him get yanked in a second half because he's struggling. I don't even think that that's bad. They're basically putting him in a position where he is not allowed to flail on the court. And the moment that he seems like he's really just getting completely head underwater, they're pulling him, they're talking things through with him, and then they're kind of assessing whether it will actually help him to get more minutes. So I think that continuing that tapered approach, I would love to see him just, especially the last 20 games of the season, absolutely let him run, have him in that starting rotation, give him a lot of minutes. But I think that the way that they are really installing a lot of basketball IQ into the way that he's reading the game, into the way that he's approaching things is helpful. Especially, like I said, the offense is only going to get harder without Zach. And so there are areas where, yes, it's great for him to be out there and clearly struggling. But there are also times where if every single one of his teammates are struggling, it is really, really difficult to look at the 20-year-old and be like, okay, so you have to learn how to put the team on your shoulders right now.
Right.
So I think striking that balance is important. I'm not going to be out here being like he needs to be playing 30 minutes every game. Just keep tapering him up into those responsibilities, and I think he'll perform well with them.
Yeah, And I think for the rest of the season, right, a lot of us aren't really necessarily focused on the wins and the losses. I mean, I guess a lot of Bulls fans are probably focused more on the losses, but it's how are these players developing?
Right.
Because that's sort of the important part for the future. I'm curious, I'll get you out of here on this actually. Uh, to start the season next year, will Kobe White and Nikola Vucevic still be on the team, or do you think they'll be gone?
Man, given the history of how this team has gone, I would say that one of them will still be there. I think it would be momentous if this front office could actually move both of them. Um, and I don't really know which is better to move at this point. I think there's really good reasons to prioritize either of them. I think the biggest difficulty is I do think I've talked to Vooch a lot about how he would really like to be. He's realistic about where he's at in his career, right? And being
Yeah.
in a rebuild is just not where a guy of his, at his point in his career wants to be. So I understand why both of them would like to be somewhere else, but I don't see them getting both of them off of that roster this summer.
Do you think Vucevic is a bit checked out? I mean, based on just your interactions with him since the trade deadline, do you think he was sort of anticipating that he was going to be moved? I know, like, I think it was a couple days right beforehand, reports coming out saying, he's kind of accepted that he would still be here. But do you think at the
Yeah.
end of the day he's disappointed and has kind of been sort of checked out in the way, his demeanor on the court and things like that since?
I think, man, I think it's a few things. I think he's frustrated. He'd tell you if you asked him, he'd tell you like he's frustrated with where the team is at. He's told me that he never expected to be the last guy standing from that trio.
Yeah.
Like he did not think that he would be the one left in Chicago if things got blown up. And I think for him, I do think that there is a certain fatigue that comes with every single trade deadline, not knowing where
Sure.
things are going to go. And so, yeah, I don't think I would use the word checked out because I think you'd be surprised by the level of effort that a lot of these guys are giving, given how it looks on the court. But I do think that there is a certain level for him, especially in his position, of just like hands up in the air, what am I supposed to do without Zach? Like
Right.
what is this offense even supposed to, especially those games without Lonzo? It's like, what are we even supposed to do out here? We don't have, and he's been very open about this, like help is not coming. It's just us. And he's kind
Yeah.
of having to get in the trenches with these kids that are a decade younger than him. And I think
Right.
there's a certain level of that, of it just being like, okay, what am I doing here? What am I getting out of this? So I don't think it's quite checked out, but I do think there's a certain level of, and Vooch is a very emotional player. He's very upfront about that. But I think he needed this all-star break, and you got to hope that he'd be able to kind of get over that hump coming out of it. But I do think there's a certain level of just mental kind of hitting your capacity of like, okay, what are we even doing? What am I supposed to
Yeah.
do on this team with this group for the rest of this season?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's why a lot of Bulls fans felt that it was critical to try him move him by the deadline because you now run the risk of his value going down even further, right? I know everyone's like, "Oh, well, he's an expiring contract now; it might be easier to move." I don't think you were going to get, anything of value for Vucevic if the trend continues the way that he's playing right now. Um, that's what's surprising to me, especially when you heard the Bulls had a couple second round picks. I think expiring deals for Looney and Peyton, which would have made sense because you free up money off your books. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
No, it's I wrote about this last week, but I think they fully missed their window with Vooch. I think he
Right.
gave them a beautiful window in January where he had that lovely shooting streak that
Yep.
everyone knew was going to end. He was never going to keep that shooting up, but he gave a beautiful little short-sighted window for them to be able to flip him for some value, get him somewhere that he would like to be,
Right.
and just do some good business, and they missed it. And that's kind of the story of just kind of where we're at. It's a lot of missed opportunities that I think when you get into the grace element, it's like, sure, you want to have grace, this stuff is hard, but you can't keep missing windows like this. You got to start moving at the right time on these guys.
And it was almost like a gift given to them, right? Because over the offseason, Vucevic had little to no value whatsoever, right? And he comes into this
Yeah.
season is having a resurgence, borderline all-star. People were talking about, oh, maybe he could get selected as an all-star. And yeah, you don't move him, but anyway, well,
Yeah.
Julia, I appreciate you making the time as always. keep up the great work over the Tribune. We'll obviously be following along. And best of luck the rest of the season. I know it's probably not going to be easy covering the team throughout the rest of this year, but hopefully we'll find some glimmer of hope and newsworthy headlines that come through it.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Of course.